Okay, so what are we going to do this morning? I want to look at what are the problems, and these are key learnings from 2013, 2014. I'm not bad at grammar, so when I say what are the problems, it's not what were the problems, but the problems that existed in 2013-14 still exist. Why do we have these problems? So in other words, what are the structural reasons that the problems that you observed in the newspaper in 2013-14 happened and still underscore the situation that goes on today? And finally, how can we, in a new market and regulatory system, make changes that have the opportunity to alleviate the problems that we see in that system today? So I'll try and move fairly quickly through the issue of what are the problems. On the first two of those points, I have additional slides. Frankly, as Murray said, the problem was the basis was horrible. Now, in this case, I'm defining the basis as the price spread between the on-farm price in Western Canada and the international values. So I'm not referring to the difference between one of the American futures exchanges. I'm simply taking the first difference between what the international values were, what was attainable. So it is, in essence, the economic cost that farmers incurred in getting their grain from the farm gate to port. The second piece is that customer service was unacceptable. As a Western grain industry, there has not been a time when we have served customers as bad as we did in the 2013-2014 growing season. Market opportunities were limited in a falling grain market, so from a farm perspective, what does that mean? That means that when we got off the combine in the fall of 2013, grain prices were $8 a bushel, and by the time a lot of people had the opportunity to move that grain, that price was below $5. So, and what does that mean? It means that by the first week of December, one of the three major grain companies sent an email to all their farm customers saying, we are done accepting new grain quantities for the rest of this growing season. Now, in the end, they loosened up, they moved some additional quantities, but they used that as an opportunity to widen their basis by almost another $1 a bushel. And finally, the burden of the failure was placed dramatically more heavily on some regions, some crops, and some portions of the market corridor than others. And so if you look at north central Saskatchewan, and you take probably the worst movement crop, which was oats, producers in that area that had done their contracting during harvest saw crop movement that was firmly booked with a customer for September-October movement, not move until the end of April or early into the next month. So that particular part of the business was sort of bearing the brunt of it. So you have a very difficult situation there. On the basis, this work comes, Dr. Richard Gray did some work for a farm coalition this fall, the Saskatchewan Wheat Development Commission, the Barley Development Commission, the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and APAS jointly submitted a presentation to the Canadian Transportation Review Panel. And basically, the numbers were somewhere in this order of magnitude. Now, I always chuckle a little bit at this. For those that followed the long-term debate about the wheat board, that Andy Schmitz on one hand had said, you know what, these guys make a lot of money on price discrimination in the international market. And Colin said, you know what, that basis at $72.50 is way too wide, right? No, it probably should be somewhere in the order of $68 or $69 if it was competitive. But last year, farmers paid $135.50 over and above the competitive identifiable costs in the market channel. So Richard estimates those total costs of the basis were somewhere in the order of $3.1 billion that came out of farm pockets over the course of that particular marketing season. Customer service. When I was on the board of the Wheat Board, we used the proxy of demurrage as a good way to hold our management's feet to the fire on the question of whether or not customers were getting good service. Demurrage is an indication of how long customers had to wait to get their boats filled, And these numbers are from Quorum's grain marketing or grain monitor program. And the last year, the 2013-14 growing season, is an estimate that Quorum has done. But it will, in the end, when the final numbers are published, be in the magnitude something north of $100 million. What does that mean? That means that we had somewhere between 35 and 50 empty boats sitting in line at the West Coast for almost half the growing season. That means that there are customers, and I've talked to a number of customers around the world, that buy our product that are in particularly some of the more specific marketing channels, and they said it will be a very long time, and there will have to be significant pricing discounts before we're back in the market for Canadian grain. That's why demurrage is a very good indicator of customer service. That, as a proxy, is a lot more expensive than $100 million, because those customers are in the hand-to-mouth. They're in a low inventory program, and frankly, it hurt a lot. So that fundamentally is the problem, and I want to move on to why, because there's been a lot of blowing smoke about the fact that it was the railway's fault, and I frankly am going to talk very little about the railways. There's a number of reasons why. The most important one Murray mentioned: we have constrained export corridors. There are different costs between the export corridors that do exist in Canada, which means that there are, by definition, economic rents. There was no understanding of the role the Canadian Wheat Board played in the grain marketing system, sort of aside from the single desk function. At the time, there was a decision to end it, so the void that was created was understood by none of the players in the system, and as a result, when that piece rolled around, it was not understood. The next one is really, really important. The elements necessary for the market solution were not in place. And what does that mean? Well, I'll use one specific piece here, and what I'm going to call the open car order system, which means that basically if you wanted to order rail capacity in the 2013-14 years, you simply put your name on a waiting list. That meant that every individual grain marketer was simply booking sales and booking rail capacity with no knowledge of how much capacity was on order in advance of that process. So the result was, and you know, this is where the railways get inappropriately hung out to dry, because people say, well, the railways failed to meet the sales commitments. The railways had no capacity to meet the sales commitments. The difficulty was that those that were making the sales had no market signal that the port was dramatically oversold. There was no way. I mean, if you look at the aggregate results for the 2013-14 crop year, the railways moved an above-average amount of grain. So what was wrong? Sure, they had a bad winter, and I'm sure they'll talk about winter and all those other things. But and they were apparently surprised by that. But the piece there that was the problem was there was no mechanism to know that the West Coast was dramatically oversold by any individual in the marketplace. The next one, and I do want to underline this one also, which is that there was no farmer access to the regulator. The Canola Council tested this and of course got thrown out. The way Canadian regulation works is that essentially the regulatory framework is an effort to push the commercial players to negotiate in good faith. So if in all efforts you don't want to end up at the regulator, what you want to do is negotiate in the direction of a competitive solution, knowing that the other player's fallback is to go to the regulator. And in a Canadian Wheat Board environment, the Canadian Wheat Board was the farmers. The farmers' commercial interest was to keep that basis as narrow as possible. And so the level of service or the final offer arbitration provisions that the regulator provided were the protection that allowed you to counterbalance the railway market power in any commercial negotiation such that you never had to go to the regulator. That was the magic of what we negotiated after the crop failure in the 95 1995 crop year. So that was the essence of what had been negotiated, and that frankly worked. If you go back to that demurrage side, there was 1 year during the 10 years that I was director of the Canadian Wheat Board that we paid demurrage, and it was $2 million. And you know, we can talk about that. But fundamentally, that keeping the right commercial players on the program was key to that success. If you think about who was the shipper that had access to the regulator in the 2013-14 growing season, that had the economic capacity to go to the regulator, it was the grain company. The grain companies have never in their history made more money than they did in the 13-14 growing season, because whenever you have bad service, you widen the basis, and all of the economic rents are going to be captured between the railway and the grain company, and the railway has a revenue cap. So the grain companies were in a position to pick up that economic rent. And so the sort of that economic pressure, they could whine, but the economic pressure to actually solve the problem was the farmer's pressure, and the farmer had no access to the regulator. If you don't take anything else from this presentation, remember that, because that has to be part of the solution. Finally, the Order in Council created incentives to make some of the inequalities worse. So all of the railway natural incentive to provide bad service to high-cost, slow-movement corridors was made worse when they had a mandate to provide a fixed block of service. So if I want to just back up very quickly on, whoops. Okay, we'll do the cost of movement first. So I mentioned that the economic alternatives. From my farm in central Saskatchewan, the cost of movement going west is roughly $72. The cost of movement going east is roughly $100. During that period, as I mentioned earlier, the price basis, the price difference between my farm and the West Coast was somewhere in that $208 range, which in this case, this is a little bit later. At that time, I pulled this slide together into March. This is after the OIC, so it had dropped to about that $63 level. But when Richard did his work, it was about $135 over and above the cost of movement. The key there is in remembering the two numbers roughly, and I'm pretty close to the border of the two catchment areas. It costs $72 to get to Tidewater going west and $100 going east. In the 13-14 growing year, you had a relatively low ocean freight period, so values at various deepwater ports were arbitraged reasonably close together. So how would a wheat board environment have solved this problem? The key there, as I mentioned, estimating and defending an aggregate level of service. So you had the aggregate level of service provision that the railways needed to provide being defended by the farmers themselves, so they had the commercial interest to take it to the regulator when they needed to. But the next one is at the operational level. You build a sales and movement plan that was, in fact, within the framework of the capacity that was available. And regardless of what regulatory framework you come up with, you have to give the players that are building the sales and movement plan the opportunity to know what that capacity is in advance. Now, the next one is to recommend the freight adjustment factor. The freight adjustment factor was a freight adjustment piece that was built in to the freight amount such that at the margin of the two catchment zones, east and west, the freights were equivalent, and the economic rents that were over and above that were rolled into the pool account. That was the impact of the freight adjustment factor, and it was adjusted depending upon the size of the crop in the West Coast catchment area. So in other words, if you're in the West Coast catchment area and you draw a little circle around, I'll catch that a little bit later. Sorry, I'll move on to that one if you will. So then that portion of producer contracts or producer offerings that could be moved within that constrained rail capacity were accepted, and there was no point in the rest of that volume sitting on the market. So it was simply not accepted for movement. It was distributed across all producers, and that was the way it did. Then the next one is that rail cars were allocated to companies based on where producers wanted to haul the grain. So essentially, the constrained rail car capacity was allocated right back to the farm gate, and there was a marketplace between the service provider and the farmer in order to allocate the existing rail car capacity. Adjust as required through the year. So this I just mentioned. The only thing I'm going to add to this is that the higher the crop, the more density there is in the western catchment area, and therefore the larger the economic rent is at the border between the two catchment areas. So that was why 13-14 was a bigger problem year, and the incentives to do the wrong thing were bigger than would be in the case in a normal crop year. So towards a solution. I'll go through each one of these quickly because I've been given the 5-minute flag and I've been trying to ignore. We need a body, and Murray has suggested one form of it. I'm going to give you a historical reference on this that is in the value chain that essentially receives the capacity from the carriers and reapportions that capacity to the users. And that can be done through various market mechanisms, but the key is to make sure that the economic incentives that everybody has in the value chain are consistent with getting a competitive solution right from one end to the other in order to make that happen. Now, this is interesting because the Conservatives imposed that on the industry in 79, and the Liberals killed it in 95, which I think is a little bit humorous, but it is something like that. And following 95, of course, the Wheat Board picked that role up. And the other one there, of course, that is the potential for a planning platform. Aggregate service, I mentioned that. I'll flip through that fairly quickly. And a GTA or a comparable body could be that in the current regulatory environment. In the absence of that, you need a different mechanism of maintaining that. Forward rail capacity, we got to get past this open order system. We have to get to where the capacity is on the table in advance so the industry can plan around the known capacity. This is trickier to develop than you would think in the absence of a third-party player because of what I call the ordering problem. The opportunities emerge and the risk that one individual within that marketing system would buy all the capacity if you simply have an auction program. So you need a mechanism of apportionment that recognizes these opportunities develop over time. Price transparency, Murray alluded a little bit to this, that asymmetry of information is an immense problem, and we need a lot more price transparency. The program that Colin had on the table for developing a futures market was rejected. We have no price discovery at the port positions, and we need price and movement data that's readily available to allow the market to function efficiently. Information in itself will change and fix some of the problems. We need to enhance market competition. Murray's put an idea on the table which I thought was interesting. I'm kind of a slow thinker, so I'd have to process it a little bit more. But the idea of, we've really focused on regulating the tar out of railways, but we frankly have 3 grain companies that just took $3.1 billion of economic rents out of the value chain and are completely unaccountable for it. The regulation needs to really, really think about how to make sure that what producers were guaranteed in 1905, such as access to producer cars, access to alternate marketing channels, are there in order to discipline that basis. So we have to ensure all non-West Coast facility owners have fair and equitable access to that handling and transportation system. There are only 3 players at the West Coast, and I've never seen them compete over anything. Rail competition, there's been a lot said about this. The only thing I would say is that the lessons in the United States have been that wherever the Surface Transportation Board imposed a competitive solution on there for Class 1s, they generally found that in spite of railway complaining, you saw railway investment and capacity go up rather than down. And that's sort of a natural solution of a firm to a competitive experience. And there are a lot of opportunities, and I actually think we can get better capacity out of existing infrastructure if we're pretty intelligent about how we design competitive access provisions. Revenue cap, it's really important to maintain. I mentioned there's a lot of economic rents. The only thing that stopped the railways from taking more than their fair share of it was the revenue cap, and there's no point in giving up what we know kept a lid on that. West Coast capacity, and I want to everybody just waves the flag on this one. It is important. it doesn't matter how much West Coast capacity you have, you're still going to have this problem because you will never build such that you can move all of every variable crop through that West Coast system. And so additional West Coast capacity is clearly in demand, but it's not going to be the panacea that the commercial players might want you to believe. So I'm sure I have pushed my 5-minute limit. I will wrap up. This was not a rail-only problem. There were market signals that the railways provided that certainly exacerbated the problem. The railways certainly had a tough winter situation that exacerbated the problem, but that wasn't the central issue. The central issue, as I said before, is that Canada has constraints in the handling and transportation system that have economic rents, and when you have corridors that are priced dramatically differently and have independent commercial decision makers making decision, everyone would choose to do their marketing through the West Coast. Full stop. So in the absence of a transparent way of people knowing when that capacity is fully utilized and of pricing that piece, you're going to have a wreck. And frankly, this was a government regulation problem. It was not a rail-only problem. The best regulatory approach is to find a mechanism that pushes the commercial players to negotiate on their own in the direction of a competitive solution. But in order to make that happen, you have to have the right economic interests at the table, and the farmers have to be at the table. So the farmers need a body to access regulatory protection. And as I'm sure in an academic audience, everyone likes to know where additional research is required. And there is a lot that's unknown about how we solve these new problems in this market environment. And we certainly need to better understand some of the ways to do the competitive access provisions. The metaphor for me is the pipeline. The service providers are the grain handlers and the railways, and we have to figure out how to have the service provisions, as Murray said, broken into component parts, offered to the linkage that makes up the chain between farmers and consumers, and have each one of those competitive parts, each one of those component parts as competitive offerings. That takes a lot of creative thinking in terms of making that marketplace work. That's not to say it's not possible. It's just to say that in order to get there, we have to understand the problem that we've got right now, and what we've got now will happen over and over again unless we make those changes. Thank you very much.